The West was never going to listen, and now it's too late. Let me take you back to the morning of June 14, 2024. That was the day Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stood before the press and, in his characteristically measured tone, declared that Russia's territorial demands in Ukraine were not only non-negotiable but extinct. The West, of course, reacted with its usual mix of outrage and condescension. NATO officials called it blackmail. The State Department labeled it unacceptable. European leaders wrung their hands and muttered about escalation. And the media? Well, they dutifully parroted the line that this was just another example of Putin's irrational aggression, another sign that Russia was losing the war and lashing out in desperation. But here's the thing, none of that is true. And if you've been paying attention to what's actually happening on the ground, rather than what's being fed to you through the transatlantic echo chamber, you'd know that this moment was inevitable. Not because Putin is some madman, but because the West has spent the last 2 years pretending that this war could be won without consequences. That Russia could be humiliated, its security concerns ignored, and its people broken, all while the US and its allies played geopolitical chess with other people's lives. I've spent 4 decades studying warfare, strategy, and the brutal logic of great power competition. I've advised generals, testified before Congress, and seen firsthand how empires overreach when they mistake their own propaganda for reality. And let me tell you, what happened on June 14 wasn't a surprise. It was a correction, one that the West should have seen coming, but chose to ignore. So let's start by dissecting the official narrative. Because if you understand what they want you to believe, you'll see just how dangerously detached from reality it really is. The official what they want you to believe. The story goes like Russia, led by an isolated and increasingly erratic Vladimir Putin, launched an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The West, in a display of moral clarity and strategic resolve, rallied to Ukraine's defense, providing billions in military aid, intelligence support, and economic sanctions. Russia, we're told, is now bogged down in a quagmire, its military degraded, its economy on the brink, and its people turning against the war. The recent territorial demands? Just another desperate gambit from a regime that knows it's losing. The data seems to support this. The US has committed over $175 billion in aid to Ukraine since 2022. The EU has matched that with its own packages. NATO has extended its presence in Eastern Europe, with new battle groups in Poland, Romania, and the Baltics. Russia's economy, we're told, is shrinking under sanctions, GDP down, inflation up, capital flight accelerating. The Institute for the Study of War, a favorite source for Western policymakers, regularly publishes maps showing Ukrainian advances, Russian retreats, and a war of attrition that Moscow simply cannot win. And then there's the moral framing. Every Western leader from Biden to Scholz to Macron has framed this as a battle between democracy and autocracy, between the rules-based order and brute force. Putin, they say, is a war criminal. His demands are illegitimate. Any concession would be appeasement, a repeat of Munich 1938. The message is Russia must be defeated, its territorial ambitions crushed, and Ukraine restored to its pre-2014 borders, if not further. But here's the problem with this: it's not true. Not in the way they're telling it, anyway. And if you dig beneath the surface, what you find isn't a story of Western resolve and Russian weakness. It's a story of Western delusion and Russian adaptation, one that has brought us to the brink of a far larger and far more dangerous conflict than anyone in Washington or Brussels seems willing to admit. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the most obvious, that Russia is losing. The Western media loves to highlight Ukrainian advances, Kherson, Kharkiv, the recent push near Chasiv Yar. And yes, Ukraine has had tactical successes. But here's what they don't tell: Ukraine is running out of men. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now over 40. Entire brigades have been wiped out. The mobilization law passed in April 2024 was so unpopular that it sparked riots in multiple cities. And despite the West's best efforts, Ukraine's manpower crisis is only getting worse. Meanwhile, Russia? Russia is winning the war of attrition. Not because its military is particularly brilliant, it's not, but because it has 3 things Ukraine doesn't: time, resources, and a population willing to fight. Russia's economy isn't collapsing. In fact, it's growing. Sanctions? They've been circumvented by China, India, and the Gulf states. Military production? Russia is outproducing the entire NATO alliance in artillery shells, drones, and basic munitions. And manpower? Russia has mobilized over 400,000 troops since 2022, with another 30,000 signing up every month. The Wagner mutiny? A blip. The Prigozhin assassination? A warning to future troublemakers. The Russian state is more stable today than it was 2 years ago. Now, let's talk about those territorial demands. The West acts shocked that Russia is now insisting on the full annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv. But why? This isn't some sudden escalation. It's the logical endpoint of a war that Russia has been fighting since 2014. The Minsk agreements? Dead on arrival. The Normandy format? A joke. The West spent 8 years pretending that Ukraine's NATO aspirations were just aspirational, while Ukraine itself passed a constitutional amendment in 2019 making NATO membership a legal obligation. Russia warned, repeatedly, that this was a red line. The West ignored it. And now, after 2 years of war, Russia is simply stating that if Ukraine won't be neutral, it won't exist in its current form. But here's where it gets interesting. The West's response to this has been to double down on the same failed strategy. More weapons. More sanctions. More rhetoric about total victory. And yet, behind the... So why the disconnect? Why does the official narrative still insist that Russia is on the ropes, when the facts say otherwise? Because admitting the truth would force the West to confront two uncomfortable. 1. This war was never winnable on the West's terms. Ukraine is not a NATO member. It never will be. And yet, the US and its allies have spent 2 years treating it as a de facto NATO proxy, pouring in weapons and money with no clear endgame. The result? A war that has killed hundreds of thousands, displaced millions, and left Ukraine in ruins, all while Russia has consolidated its gains and exited its war aims. 2. The West's strategy has been built on a foundation of lies. From the start, the US has framed this as a war between good and evil, democracy and autocracy. But the reality is far messier. Ukraine is not a liberal democracy. It's a corrupt oligarchy with a neo-Nazi problem that the West has conveniently ignored. And Russia? Russia is not some irrational rogue state. It's a great power with legitimate security concerns that the West has spent decades dismissing. So what's really happening here? The West is losing, and it doesn't know how to stop. The broader geopolitical world in transition. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the end of an era, the era of unchallenged American hegemony. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it could reshape the world in its own image. Democracy promotion. Regime change. Economic globalization. The rules-based order. And for a while, it worked. The Soviet Union collapsed. China was brought into the WTO. The US became the world's sole superpower. But that world is gone. And the war in Ukraine is the clearest sign yet that the old order is breaking down. Let's talk about multipolarity. For decades, the US has acted as if it could dictate the terms of global politics. But today, we live in a world where three great powers, America, China, and Russia, are competing for influence, and where secondary powers like India, Iran, and Turkey are carving out their own spheres of interest. The war in Ukraine is the first major conflict of this new era. And it's exposing the limits of American power. Russia is not backing down. It has bet everything on this war, and it's willing to fight for as long as it takes. Why? Because for Russia, this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about survival. A Ukraine in NATO would mean American missiles on Russia's border, just as they are in Poland and Romania. And Russia will not accept that. China is watching closely. Beijing has no interest in seeing Russia collapse. Why? Because a weakened Russia would mean a unipolar world dominated by the US, a world where China is next on the regime change list. So China has thrown Russia an economic lifeline, buying its oil, selling it dual-use technology, and ensuring that sanctions don't work. And if the US pushes too hard? China has made it clear that it will respond, whether in Taiwan, the South China Sea, or elsewhere. The global South is sitting this one out. India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, none of them have joined the West's sanctions. Why? Because they see this as a European war, not a global one. And they're not wrong. The US has spent decades lecturing the world about sovereignty and self-determination. But when it comes to Ukraine, suddenly those principles don't apply. The hypocrisy is too glaring to ignore. And then there's Europe. The EU has tied itself to the US in this war, but it's paying a heavy price. Energy costs are through the roof. Industry is fleeing. And the continent's military is being hollowed out, with European armies sending their best equipment to Ukraine while their own stocks dwindle. Meanwhile, the US is using the war to tighten its grip on Europe, pushing for more NATO action, more defense spending, and more dependence on American LNG. This is the real geopolitical. The US is trying to maintain its dominance by keeping Europe weak and Russia contained. But it's failing. Because Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's not a declining power. It's a resurgent one, with a nuclear arsenal, a vast territory, and a population that is more united than at any point since 1945. And that brings us to the most dangerous part of this: the West's refusal to accept reality. Military, the illusion of a quick victory. Let's talk about the military situation. Because if there's one thing that should terrify anyone paying attention, it's the sheer naivety of the West's approach to this war. The US and its allies have spent 2 years arming Ukraine with the expectation that it could win. But win what, exactly? The pre-2022 borders? The pre-2014 borders? The complete collapse of Russia? None of these outcomes were ever realistic. And yet, the West has doubled down on the fantasy that more weapons, more money, and more time would somehow turn the tide. Let me tell you something I've learned from decades of studying: attrition wars are won by the side with the deepest pockets and the strongest will. And in this war, that side is Russia. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. Russia is not. Ukraine has lost an estimated 70,000 killed and 120,000 wounded. Russia's losses are higher, perhaps 120,000 killed and 200,000 wounded, but Russia has a population of 143 million. Ukraine has 36 million, and half of them are women, children, or elderly. The math is: Russia can afford to lose men. Ukraine cannot. Russia is outproducing the West in artillery shells, drones, and basic munitions. The US promised Ukraine 1 million shells in 2024. It delivered 300,000. Russia is firing 10,000 shells a day. The West can't keep up. And while the US is sending F-16s and ATACMS, Russia is flooding the battlefield with cheap, effective drones and electronic warfare systems that are neutralizing Ukraine's advantages. Russia now controls 20% of Ukraine. That's more than it held in 2022. And it's not just the Donbass. It's Kherson, Zaporizhia, and now parts of Kharkiv. The front lines are stabilizing, and Russia is digging in. Meanwhile, Ukraine's much-hyped counteroffensive in 2023 failed spectacularly. And the West's response? More of the same. Now, let's talk about escalation. Because that's the real danger here. The West has been playing a dangerous game, assuming that Russia won't respond to its provocations. But Russia has responded. It's mobilized its economy. It's exited its military. It's formed a de facto alliance with North Korea, Iran, and China. And it's made it clear that if the West crosses certain lines, like sending troops to Ukraine, or providing long-range missiles that can strike deep into Russia, it will retaliate. And yet, the hawks in Washington and Brussels keep pushing. They want to send more weapons. They want to train Ukrainian pilots on F-16s. They want to give Ukraine NATO-level intelligence. And they're doing it all while pretending that Russia won't escalate. This is madness. Pure and simple. I've seen this movie before. Iraq. Afghanistan. Libya. The US starts a war with the best of intentions, only to find itself trapped in a quagmire it can't escape. And every time, the hawks say the same: just a little more time. Just a little more money. Just a little more force. But wars don't work like that. And this one is no different. The domestic political why the West can't back down. Now, let's talk about politics. Because this war isn't just about geopolitics. It's about domestic politics, and that's where things get really dangerous. In the US, the war in Ukraine has become a partisan issue. The Biden administration has staked its entire foreign policy on standing with Ukraine. Republicans, meanwhile, are split. Some want to keep funding the war, others want to cut it off. And the American people? They're tired. A recent poll showed that 62% of Americans oppose more aid to Ukraine. But the political class isn't listening. Why? Because for the establishment, this war is about more than Ukraine. It's about American credibility. If the US loses in Ukraine, the thinking goes, it will embolden China, Iran, and every other adversary. So the administration keeps pouring money into the war, even as the American people grow increasingly skeptical. And then there's Europe. The EU has tied itself to the US in this war, but the cracks are showing. Hungary has blocked aid packages. Slovakia has elected a pro-Russian government. France is talking about strategic autonomy, which is code for we can't rely on the US forever. And Germany? Germany is trapped. It spent decades outsourcing its security to America, and now it's paying the price. The result? A war that no one can afford to lose, but no one knows how to win. And that brings us to the most dangerous part of this: the West's inability to admit defeat. Because here's the Russia has already won. Not in the sense that it's conquered all of Ukraine, it hasn't. But in the sense that it has achieved its core: preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, securing its western border, and demonstrating to the world that the US is not invincible. But the West can't admit that. Because admitting it would mean admitting that the last 30 years of American foreign policy have been a failure. That the rules-based order is a myth. That the US is not the indispensable nation it claims to be. And so, instead of facing reality, the West doubles down. More weapons. More sanctions. More rhetoric. And all the while, the war grinds on, the body count rises, and the risk of a wider conflict grows. Scenario: where do we go from here? So where does this end? Let's look at the possibilities. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. The war drags on for another year or two, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Russia consolidates its gains in the east and south. Ukraine becomes a rump state, dependent on Western aid but unable to retake its lost territory. The US and Europe declare victory: we stopped Russia. While quietly accepting that Ukraine will never be whole again. The sanctions regime collapses as the global south refuses to comply. And Russia, though weakened, emerges as a regional hegemon with a permanent military presence in Ukraine. This is the best outcome for the West, but it's still a disaster. Because it means that the US has spent hundreds of billions of dollars and thousands of lives to achieve nothing. Russia is still there. Ukraine is still broken. And the world has seen that American power has limits. Scenario 2, the Great Escalation. This is the nightmare scenario. The West, desperate to avoid defeat, crosses one of Russia's red lines. Maybe it sends troops to Ukraine. Maybe it provides long-range missiles that can strike Moscow. Maybe it tries to assassinate Putin. And Russia responds, not with a nuclear strike, but with something just as devastating. A full mobilization. A cyber offensive that cripples Western infrastructure. A blockade of the Baltic states. And suddenly, we're not talking about a regional war anymore, we're talking about World War III. Now, what most people don't realize is that Russia has been preparing for this possibility for decades. Since the 1990s, when NATO action first became a serious threat, Moscow has been hardening its defenses, diversifying its economy, and building alliances with countries that don't buy into the American-led order. China, Iran, North Korea, these aren't just opportunistic partnerships. They're part of a long-term strategy to create a multipolar world where no single power can dictate terms to the rest. Let me explain why this matters. The West still operates under the assumption that economic pressure alone can bring Russia to its knees. But that's a Cold War-era mindset, and the world has changed. Russia's GDP is smaller than Italy's, sure, but its military-industrial complex is running at full capacity, and its trade with the global south has actually increased since 2022. Sanctions? They've hurt, but they haven't broken Russia. In fact, they've accelerated its pivot away from the West. The ruble is stable. Inflation is under control. And while Europe freezes through another winter, Russia is selling oil to India at a discount and buying back refined products at a profit. Here's the uncomfortable: the West's economic leverage is eroding, and fast. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now accounts for over 40% of the world's population and a third of global GDP. And they're not just talking about de-dollarization anymore, they're doing it. Trade in local currencies. New payment systems. Gold-backed alternatives. The dollar's dominance isn't going to collapse overnight, but the trend is unmistakable. And every time the US freezes another country's assets or imposes secondary sanctions, it pushes more nations into the arms of those who offer an alternative. Now, let's talk about the military implications. The Pentagon likes to pretend this is still a contest between NATO's high-tech forces and Russia's Soviet-era relics. But that's a fantasy. Russia has adapted. It's lost tanks, yes, but it's also learned how to counter Western precision weapons. Electronic warfare. Decoys. Swarm tactics. And while the US is still debating whether to send F-16s to Ukraine, Russia is producing drones, missiles, and artillery shells at a rate that would make a World War II quartermaster blush. What's more, Russia's nuclear doctrine has evolved. The old escalate to de-escalate model is still there, but now it's layered with something more: the willingness to use tactical nukes not just as a last resort, but as a tool of coercion. Putin has made it clear that any direct NATO intervention in Ukraine would be met with a response that goes beyond conventional forces. And here's the kicker: he's not bluffing. The Russian military has been conducting drills for nuclear strikes in the Baltic and Black Sea regions. The message is: if you cross this line, we will burn your cities. But the real military game changer isn't happening in Ukraine. It's happening in the Arctic. Russia has been rebuilding its northern defenses for years: new bases, new icebreakers, new missile systems. And why? Because the Arctic is the new geopolitical battleground. Control the Arctic, and you control the shortest route between North America and Eurasia. You control access to vast energy reserves. And most importantly, you control the future of global trade. NATO has been caught flat-footed here. The US Navy is still struggling to project power in the high north, while Russia is already deploying hypersonic missiles in the region. So where does this leave us? The West is trapped in a paradox. It can't admit defeat in Ukraine, because that would shatter the illusion of American primacy. But it can't win, because Russia has already achieved its strategic objectives. And every time the US and Europe double down: more weapons, more sanctions, more rhetoric, they risk triggering the very escalation they claim to want to avoid. The smart play would be to negotiate. Not from a position of weakness, but from a position of realism. Recognize that Ukraine will never be a NATO member. Accept that Russia isn't going to give back Crimea or the Donbass. And start thinking about how to stabilize Europe without turning it into a permanent battleground. But that would require leadership. And right now, the West doesn't have it. Instead, we're sleepwalking toward a wider war. Not because anyone wants it, but because no one has the courage to admit that the old rules don't apply anymore. The unipolar moment is over. The question is whether the US and its allies can adapt, or whether they'll keep chasing the ghost of a world that no longer exists. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Russia's ambitions, it's about the West's internal rot. The political class in Washington and Brussels is still operating on autopilot, recycling the same tired talking points from the 1990s, as if the world hasn't changed in 30 years. They talk about rules-based order and democratic values, but what they really mean is maintaining a system that benefits them, even if it no longer reflects reality. And the American public is waking up to this. Look at the numbers. A Pew Research poll from last year found that 62% of Americans believe the U.S. should focus on domestic problems rather than global leadership. That's not isolationism, that's exhaustion. After 20 years of wars in the Middle East, trillions of dollars wasted, and no clear victories, the average citizen is what's in it for us? And the establishment doesn't have an answer. They still think they can sell the same old story, America must lead the free world, but the audience isn't buying it anymore. Here's the uncomfortable: the Biden administration's Ukraine policy isn't just failing on the battlefield, it's failing at home. The $113 billion Congress has already approved for Ukraine money that could have gone to fixing America's crumbling infrastructure, lowering healthcare costs, or securing the southern border has become a political liability. And it's not just Republicans who are skeptical. A growing number of Democrats, especially in swing states, are quietly distancing themselves from the White House's blank check approach. They see the writing on the if this war drags on, it's going to cost them their seats in 2024. Let me explain why this matters. The US isn't just fighting Russia in Ukraine, it's fighting itself. The political divide in America has never been wider, and foreign policy is now a weapon in that fight. The right accuses the left of being soft on Russia, while the left accuses the right of being warmongers. Neither side is willing to admit that the entire strategy is broken. And the longer this goes on, the more dangerous it becomes. Because here's what happens: and if the war in Ukraine continues to stagnate, or worse, if Russia makes another major push, Congress will face immense pressure to cut off funding. And if that happens, the US will be forced into a humiliating retreat. Not because Russia defeated us militarily, but because we defeated ourselves politically. The Europeans, who have been riding America's coattails for decades, will be left scrambling. And Russia? They'll have achieved exactly what they: a weakened NATO, a divided Europe, and a US that's too distracted by its own problems to challenge them elsewhere. Now, let's talk about Europe. The continent is in denial. They still think they can outsource their security to Washington, even as America's attention drifts toward Asia. But the reality is that Europe's military capabilities are a joke. Germany, the economic powerhouse of the continent, spends just 1.5% of its GDP on defense, less than Poland. France has a capable military, but it's stretched thin between Africa and the Indo-Pacific. And the rest? Most European countries couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag. The problem isn't just money, it's will. Europe has spent the last 30 years pretending that war was a relic of the past. They built their economies on cheap Russian energy, outsourced their defense to the US, and convinced themselves that diplomacy alone could solve any problem. Well, guess what? That world is gone. And now they're stuck between a rock and a hard: either they start spending real money on defense, or they accept that they're no longer in charge of their own security. The most likely scenario? A slow-motion collapse of European unity. The EU was built on the assumption that economic integration would lead to political integration. But when push comes to shove, national interests always win. Look at Hungary. Look at Slovakia. Look at the growing skepticism in Italy and even Germany. These countries aren't going to keep writing blank checks for Ukraine if it means freezing in the dark next winter. And once the first domino falls, the rest will follow. So where does that leave us? The US is politically fractured, Europe is militarily impotent, and Russia is playing the long game. The only way out of this mess is a negotiated settlement, but not the kind the West is currently offering. Right now, the US and its allies are still demanding that Russia withdraw from all occupied territories, including Crimea. That's not a negotiation, that's a surrender demand. And Putin isn't going to accept it. What's needed is a deal that recognizes reality. Crimea is gone. The Donbass is gone. The question is whether the West can accept that and move on, or whether it will keep chasing the fantasy of total victory. The smart play would be to offer Russia a face-saving off a formal neutralization of Ukraine, security guarantees, and an end to NATO action. In return, Russia withdraws from the rest of the occupied territories and agrees to a long-term ceasefire. But that would require leadership, something that's in short supply these days. Instead, we're likely to see more of the half measures, empty rhetoric, and a slow drift toward escalation. And if that happens, the next phase of this conflict won't be fought in Ukraine. It'll be fought in the Arctic, in the Baltics, or even in the streets of European cities. The unipolar moment is over. The question is whether the West can adapt or whether it will keep pretending that the world still works the way it did in 1991. And if history is any guide, the answer isn't encouraging. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine, it's about the internal rot in Western political systems that makes any coherent response nearly impossible. Take the United States, for example. The Biden administration is trapped in a paradox of its own making. On one hand, they're trying to rally Europe with the same old Cold War rhetoric, democracy versus autocracy, the rules-based order, all that. On the other, they're hemorrhaging domestic support for the war. A recent Pew Research poll from June showed that only 31% of Americans believe the U.S. is providing the right amount of support to Ukraine, while 44% say it's too much. That's not just partisan bickering, that's a fundamental shift in public sentiment. And when the public turns, the politicians follow, usually kicking and screaming. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. isn't just funding this war, it's funding its own political fragmentation. The $61 billion aid package passed in April was a last-gasp effort, and even then, it came with strings attached like the requirement to seize Russian assets, which is legally dubious and diplomatically reckless. The administration knows this money won't last. By the time the next fiscal year rolls around, the political calculus will have changed. The Republicans, or at least the Trump-aligned faction, are already positioning themselves as the party of peace through strength, that is, strength at home, not endless wars abroad. And if Trump wins in November, all bets are off. He's made no secret of his disdain for NATO's freeloaders and his admiration for Putin's strength. Whether that's genuine or just bluster doesn't matter, what matters is that the transatlantic alliance could fracture overnight. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is no longer the indispensable nation. It's the distracted nation. The American political class is so consumed by its own dysfunction, impeachments, indictments, culture wars, that it can't see the forest for the trees. Meanwhile, Russia is playing a different game entirely. They're not just fighting in Ukraine, they're fighting for the future of their own political system. Putin's approval ratings, despite the war's costs, remain above 80%. That's not because Russians are brainwashed, it's because Putin has convinced them that this is an existential struggle against a decadent West that wants to erase their identity. And in a way, he's right. The West does want to erase the Russia of Putin's vision, a Russia that's sovereign, orthodox, and resistant to liberal hegemony. The problem is, the West doesn't have a coherent alternative to offer. Now, let's talk about Europe. The continent is sleepwalking into a crisis of its own making. The European Commission's latest report on defense spending shows that only 10 of the 27 EU member states meet the NATO target of 2% of GDP. Germany, the economic powerhouse, is still dithering over its Zeitenwende, Scholz's big promise to modernize the Bundeswehr. 2 years after the invasion, Germany's military is still a shambles. The latest audit revealed that the Bundeswehr has only enough ammunition for 2 days of high-intensity combat. 2 days. That's not a military, that's a Potemkin village. And yet, the EU keeps doubling down on its moral posturing. Ursula von der Leyen's recent speech in Brussels framed the war as a battle for European values, as if values alone can stop a Russian tank. The problem is, values don't fill gas tanks or heat homes. The European public is waking up to this reality. In France, Marine Le Pen's national rally is surging in the polls, promising to end the war by cutting off military aid to Ukraine. In Germany, the AfD is now the second most popular party in some eastern states. These aren't fringe movements, they're mainstream reactions to the failure of the establishment to deliver security or prosperity. So where does this leave us in the next 12 to 18 months? The most likely scenario is a slow-motion unraveling of Western unity, punctuated by sudden crises. Picture winter 2024 to 2025. Europe is facing another energy crunch because the US can't deliver enough LNG to replace Russian gas. Germany's industrial base is collapsing. Chemical giant BASF has already moved key operations to China. The US is distracted by its election, and Congress is deadlocked over another aid package. Ukraine, desperate for ammunition, launches a risky counteroffensive that fails spectacularly. The Russian advance continues, but this time, there's no Western response. The EU fractures as Poland and the Baltics demand more action, while Hungary and Slovakia block further sanctions. NATO's Article 5 becomes a paper tiger because no one believes the US would risk nuclear war over Narva or Suwałki. At that point, Putin will make his move. Not a full-scale invasion of NATO territory, that would be too risky, but a series of hybrid cyber strikes on critical infrastructure, sabotage in the Baltics, maybe even a limited incursion to protect Russian-speaking populations. The West will dither, the US will issue stern warnings, and Europe will realize it's on its own. That's when the real negotiations begin, not on Western terms, but on Russia's. The tragedy is that this was all avoidable. Back in 2014, after Crimea, the West could have accepted the reality of Russian influence in its near abroad and worked to stabilize the region through diplomacy. Instead, it chose action, NATO, EU, the whole liberal order playbook. Then, in 2022, it could have pushed for a negotiated settlement when Ukraine was at its strongest. Instead, it chose escalation, betting that sanctions and weapons would break Russia. Now, we're left with a binary: accept a humiliating defeat or risk a wider war. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. In 1938, Chamberlain returned from Munich waving a piece of paper, declaring peace for our time. We all know how that turned out. But here's the appeasement isn't always wrong. Sometimes, it's the only rational choice. The question is whether the West still has the wisdom to recognize when to fight and when to cut its losses. Right now, the signs aren't encouraging. The establishment is still clinging to the illusion of total victory, while the public is increasingly asking, what's the endgame? And when the public stops believing in the mission fails. The only thing worse than losing a war is losing it slowly, with no plan for what comes in. That's where we're headed. And the clock is ticking.